Welcome to lecture number 14, The Impending Crisis. Many believe the Mexican War would unite the nation as America acquired valuable territories and resources. Instead, the question of whether or not slavery would expand into these new regions tore the country apart by 1861. Politics during the 1850s were rife with controversy. This lecture will address politics of this era by first addressing a major compromise reached between different factions in 1850. It prevented war in that year, but following the compromise, a series of crises slowly led the nation closer to war. On the right, we see a cover of a best-selling book which heightened tension between supporters and opponents of slavery. Immediately following the Mexican War, a series of political controversies seemed to come to a head. We will explore some of those controversies and how they were resolved through compromise. The first two controversies dealt with land acquired during the Mexican War. First, would slavery expand into these new territories? Secondly, what would happen with Texas and California? Texas was claiming parts of New Mexico and other regions. It also had developed a large national debt. California had applied for statehood. Would Congress let it be organized as a state? The yellow and orange areas, which are circled on this map, represent territories acquired during the 1840s. The question was, would slavery expand there? Remember that controversy the Texans had with Mexico over their proper boundary? The lines indicated in black roughly outlined the claims Texans continued to make after it entered the Union. Another controversy was also raised, which had been developing for some time. Some Americans felt the existence of slavery in the nation's capital was embarrassing for the nation as diplomats visited the country from overseas. Others had no problem with slavery's existence there. Different groups of Americans had their own solutions to these problems facing the nation. Some Americans supported free soil. They argued all new territory acquired by the United States should be free from slavery. Politically, this issue of slavery's expansion into the Southwest had been raised on the eve of the Mexican War by the Wilmot Proviso. This amendment to a spending bill declared that any territory acquired by the United States from Mexico be free from slavery. It was defeated, but Free Soilers would have supported this proposal. A second group were supporters of a concept called popular sovereignty. This would allow people living in the new territories to decide for themselves if they wanted slavery to be legal or illegal where they lived. Finally, other Americans wanted to solve this problem by extending the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The area circled on this map shows the original Missouri Compromise line. When this was implemented by Congress in the 1820s, it stipulated that slavery could not exist north of this line in the Louisiana Territory. This additional black line would demonstrate an extension of the Missouri Compromise line, which some groups supported. The question was, who could develop a compromise? Compromise had been the foundation of the American political system since the Constitutional Convention. This cartoon on the right makes fun of President Zachary Taylor trying to balance the concerns of the South versus the Wilmot Proviso. Into this quagmire stepped none other than Henry Clay, the great compromiser. At age 73, he worked to gain consensus on a wide range of proposals, but even the great compromiser failed. Up stepped another politician, a member of the Senate from Illinois whose name was Stephen Douglas. In the end, Douglas successfully led what came to be known as the Compromise of 1850 through Congress. Clay's original proposal had several provisions. Everyone found something to dislike in it. Douglas succeeded by breaking the compromise down into smaller bills. Overall, the Compromise of 1850 had 5 primary provisions. First, California entered the Union as a free state. Secondly, the rest of the American Southwest was divided into 2 territories, Utah and New Mexico. Slavery in these 2 territories would be determined by popular sovereignty. Most of California's residents did not support the expansion of slavery anyway, as prospectors did not want slave owners to arrive with hundreds of slaves ready to dig for gold. The area in the red box identifies the new territories of Utah and New Mexico. The third provision dealt with Texas. Texans finally agreed to drop their claims for additional territory, and the current boundaries of Texas were established. In return, the United States assumed the debt Texas had developed under its independence as the Lone Star Republic. This is the slide shown earlier, where the area outlined in black identifies the territory initially claimed by the state of Texas. This map shows the smaller border of Texas after it gave up its claims to other territory. The region in black illustrates the rough boundaries of Texas' original claims. The final 2 provisions of the Compromise dealt with slavery specifically. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, was prohibited in Washington, D.C., but slavery would continue to be legal. And finally, a stricter fugitive slave law was put into effect for the entire nation. Here's one final look at that map of the nation in 1850. As you can see, even though a crisis was averted, the nation was becoming more divided. In northern regions, shown in green, slavery was prohibited. In southern regions, shown in yellow, slavery was legal. And in the red, we see slavery would be determined by popular sovereignty. While the country did remain divided, the compromise was significant. It was important because it prevented war, if only for 10 years, but it's still significant because it showed that through compromise, the American political system could survive. Over those next 10 years, the northern states grew in population and its industrial power in comparison to the South. Following the passage of the Compromise, the nation faced a series of crises which eventually took the country one step closer to war. The first crisis involved one of the provisions of the Compromise itself, the new Fugitive Slave Law. The law included 3 key provisions. First, all runaway slaves had to be returned to their owners. This was nothing new, but it targeted recent runaways as well as people who had escaped to freedom years earlier. Secondly, it became illegal to aid a runaway slave, so whites, opposed to slavery, could face jail time or fines. This map identifies the many routes taken by slaves as they escaped slavery. It's nearly impossible to determine how many slaves actually escaped on the Underground Railroad, but both supporters and opponents of slavery acknowledged its existence. In a final key provision, accused runaways were denied a jury trial. Instead, a judge decided their fate. Magistrates involved received $10 for ruling in favor of the slave owner and $5 for ruling in support of the accused runaway. These seem to be violations of fundamental American rights. The Fugitive Slave Law was important because it absolutely infuriated opponents of slavery in the North and turned many moderates toward the anti-slavery ranks. It also demonstrated slavery was a national problem, not one simply isolated to one region of the country. For more information about the Fugitive Slave Law, you may click on one of the hyperlinks below. The next crisis involved a book published in 1852 written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, identified the horrors of slavery in her novel. She chronicled the life of Uncle Tom, a loyal slave who was eventually sold away from his paternalistic owner. In this emotional anti-slavery story, Uncle Tom is eventually beaten to death by his new owner. The book became an immediate bestseller nationally and internationally. In its first year alone, over 300,000 copies were sold. It was even turned into a popular play. The theater poster here identifies Uncle Tom's beating at the hands of the evil Simon Legree. You can click on the hyperlink below to more information about the book's impact. Uncle Tom's Cabin was important because it angered people in both the North and South. Northerners identified with the book's message and became more sympathetic to the anti-slavery cause. Southerners were infuriated as they argued Stowe misrepresented the treatment of slaves by slaveholders. The next crisis addressed events associated with the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. We can begin with some background. By the 1850s, many, particularly those in the North, hoped to construct a railroad linking the rest of the nation with the newly acquired territories out west. The only problem was that much of the West remained unorganized territory. As you can see with this map of the United States in 1850, vast tracts of land in the West continued to remain unorganized. Support was strong by many for a transcontinental railroad, but many politicians balked at having it run through territories unorganized by the national government. Another factor influencing events was the desire by many Southerners to see slavery expand into new Western territories. However, the Missouri Compromise, passed by Congress in the 1820s, prohibited its expansion into many parts of the West. Here we see that Missouri Compromise line. Congress had etched in stone over 3 decades before that slavery could never expand in the Louisiana Purchase territory north of the latitude line 36 degrees 30 minutes. This is when Senator Stephen Douglas stepped in. A railroad to the west would undoubtedly benefit his home state of Illinois, and if he crafted a compromise pleasing to both Northerners and Southerners, he might be able to win the presidency in a future election. So, in 1854, Douglas proposed and Congress passed what came to be known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. First, it created 2 new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. This map identifies the boundaries of the newly created Kansas and Nebraska territories, which had originally become American soil with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The final 2 provisions of the Act were quite controversial. The Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise. Finally, it determined the legal status of slavery in Kansas and Nebraska would be determined by popular sovereignty. By acting as a champion for westward expansion and democracy in the form of popular sovereignty, Douglas hoped to gain popularity. Instead, Douglas underestimated opposition to slavery's expansion. The significance of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was twofold. First, it infuriated opponents of slavery. The Missouri Compromise had declared that slavery would never expand into this area. Now its expansion was possibly right around the corner. Secondly, it led to the end of the Second American Party system. Ever since the late 1820s, the nation was dominated by 2 political parties. Initially, the focus of each dealt with reactions to Andrew Jackson's policies, but they did evolve over time. Jackson's supporters were Democrats, and his opponents were Whigs. Each party had some level of support in each region of the nation. Not a single Northern Whig in the House of Representatives voted in favor of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Within a short period of time, the Whig Party ceased to exist altogether. The Kansas-Nebraska Act also led to Bleeding Kansas. Both supporters and opponents of slavery flocked to Kansas. An initial election held in 1855 was tainted by fraud, as many pro-slavery advocates from Missouri voted illegally and elected their candidates to the legislature. Eventually, there was bloodshed between supporters of slavery and Free Soilers in Kansas. This map identifies several areas where attacks were undertaken by both sides. The arrow points to the location of an attack near Pottawatomie Creek. Pottawatomie Creek was the location of a brutal massacre. There, abolitionist John Brown, along with some other men, abducted a group of pro-slavery advocates and murdered them. One was shot to death, and the others were hacked to pieces. The image here shows a group of anti-slavery men armed and ready to fight. This political cartoon shows how tension found its way to the United States Senate of all places. During debate concerning events in Kansas, Senator Charles Sumner delivered a speech highly critical of slaveholders and a specific defender of slavery in the Senate. Shortly thereafter, a relative of the insulted senator, who was also a member of the United States House of Representatives named Preston Brooks, physically beat Sumner with his cane on the floor of the U.S. Senate. As if those events weren't enough to show the nation was facing a crisis, a decision handed down by the Supreme Court only added flames to the fire of debate over slavery. We can start with some background to the Dred Scott decision. This case involved a slave named Dred Scott, who originally lived in the slave state of Missouri, but was then taken by his owner to the state of Illinois and Wisconsin Territory, regions where slavery was illegal. Scott sued his owner for his freedom. Scott's legal case was based on his residence in the free state of Illinois, which had prohibited slavery, and Wisconsin Territory, which originally had been organized as part of Michigan, as shown here. Congress had prohibited slavery in the Wisconsin Territory in the Missouri Compromise. Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote the decision handed down by the majority in 1857. First, he argued, Scott was not granted his freedom. Residence in areas where slavery was illegal did not mean slaves could be freed. Secondly, he declared that blacks, whether slave or free, were not citizens of the United States and therefore did not have any citizenship rights. He then continued by declaring Congress had no authority to ban slavery anywhere because slaves were the property of their owners and private property was protected by the Constitution. Only states had the right to ban slavery. Taney's broad ruling was supposed to settle the debate over slavery, but it only made things worse. This decision infuriated many in the North, while Southerners saw it as validation for what they had been saying about the legal status of slavery for decades. Either way, it was important to opponents of slavery because they feared the actions of the courts might allow slavery to expand to additional areas, and it reinforced the notion that slavery was not just a regional problem, but a national one as well. For more information about this subject, you may click on the hyperlinks below. The Dred Scott decision was handed down in 1857. The next year was an election year. In 1858, many became interested in a series of debates between two candidates vying for a Senate seat in Illinois. The candidates were Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. Stephen Douglas was a member of the Senate and had already earned a national reputation for himself. He was a strong supporter of westward expansion and a champion for popular sovereignty. He was also known for his support of the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Lincoln was an Illinois lawyer with humble origins. He was also a one-term member of Congress who gained fame for his opposition to the Mexican War. Lincoln was a member of the brand new Republican Party, which began in the 1850s. There were a wide range of issues different Republicans supported, but one issue which united them was their opposition to the expansion of slavery into new areas. The highlight of the campaign came with a series of public debates between Lincoln and Douglas in which the two argued over national policies in the context of the Dred Scott decision. Douglas tried to portray Lincoln as an extremist on slavery, but Lincoln rejected abolitionism. At Freeport, Lincoln forced Douglas to admit that people living in the territories could effectively outlaw slavery by refusing to enforce laws in support of the institution. This was good enough for people living in Illinois, as Douglas won re-election, but it cost Douglas votes in the South when he ran for president in 1860. Even though Lincoln lost this election, the Lincoln-Douglas debates were important. As segments of their speeches were printed in Eastern papers, the nation read as the debates continued. It also demonstrated that Abraham Lincoln was a rising star in the Republican Party. If the Lincoln-Douglas debates caught the nation's attention intellectually, John Brown's raid in Harper's Ferry raised the specter of war to new levels. If you remember, John Brown was an abolitionist. He believed he was put on earth by God to rid the nation of the evils of slavery. This slide from earlier in the presentation outlines one of Brown's actions in Kansas. He and some supporters were responsible for the murder of the 5 pro-slavery advocates in the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. In 1859, Brown developed a plan to capture a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He, along with a small group of supporters, hoped to then use the weapons to lead a slave insurrection in Virginia. The group successfully captured the arsenal in October of 1859, but there was no slave insurrection. The plan was doomed to fail from the start. It involved Brown and his 18 followers fighting against the United States government. Soon after they captured the building, it was surrounded by local militia. Brown was then arrested, put on trial for treason, and executed by December. For more information about Brown and his actions, you may click on the hyperlinks below. The actions of John Brown truly were significant. When Brown's correspondence with Northern abolitionists became known, many Southerners were shocked. Following his execution, Brown was treated like a martyr, rather than a traitor, in some Northern cities. This influenced some Southerners to believe that many in the North were abolitionists, determined to fight to free slaves. Some have called this the final straw which led to war. Some in the South began contemplating secession in 1860, but as events would unfold, no states would leave the Union until after the presidential election in that year. This political cartoon from the election of 1860 captures some of the chaos associated with the election. There were 4 candidates in the election, and each is portrayed in the image. The candidates appear to be ripping the nation apart during this national election. The first of the 4 candidates was Stephen Douglas. He was a Northern Democrat and supported popular sovereignty as the solution as to whether slavery should expand into new territories. The Southern Democrat, as the party split in the election, was John Breckinridge, who supported the expansion of slavery into all new territory. Abraham Lincoln was the Republican nominee. He would allow slavery to remain where it already existed, but wanted to prohibit its expansion into new areas. Finally, John Bell looked for compromise. He ran on the Constitutional Union Party ticket. He supported the Union, the Constitution, and enforcement of laws. The results of this election were rather unique. Abraham Lincoln clearly won the election with 180 electoral votes, but his support was strictly in the northern states and far west, as he won only 39% of the popular vote. Breckinridge came in second, but his support was limited primarily to the states of the lower South. Following Lincoln's victory in the election, calls for secession grew even louder. New compromises were suggested, but not adopted. Even before Lincoln's inauguration, in December of 1861, the state of South Carolina voted to break its ties with the Union. It was followed by 6 additional states. This map identifies the secession of the southern states as they formed the Confederacy. The states shown in brown, from the Deep South, were the first to secede from the Union. A great deal of information has been explored in this presentation. However, there are a few final thoughts which can be considered. This lecture has focused primarily on American politics during the 1850s. By the end of the decade, political leaders were no longer able to reach a compromise solution to solve the crisis facing the nation. Maybe you could describe several important events included in this presentation and evaluate which you believe to be the most important factor leading several southern states to secede from the Union. With the secession of the 7 states of the Deep South, it was clear the American experiment in democracy had failed. However, the next presentation will show how the nation fought a civil war and eventually became reunited. This ends lecture number 14. The next few slides will have hyperlinks to more information and a list of sources used to create this presentation. Have a great day.